whether it's journalism or fiction or creative nonfiction, you're telling a story, you're gathering details, you're making sure that the details are important and contribute to the story.
Hey there, and welcome to the Your Creative Mind podcast. I'm your host, Izolda. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. You are in for a treat today. We are joined by Sarah Seltzer. And the thing about Sarah is that, check this out, she's a journalist. She's an editor at Lilith Magazine, and she's the author of the USA Today bestselling novel, The Singer Sisters. Sarah spent years exploring how creativity, culture, and activism weave through our lives, and she brings a grounded and deeply human perspective to making meaningful art in times like these, really chaotic times. So if you've ever struggled to balance work, family, and your creative drive, or wondered how to turn even your personal history into something that's powerful storytelling, I think this conversation is going to give you some clarity, some comfort, and more than a little courage. Sarah's thoughtful approach makes the creative path feel not just possible, but inviting. Let's get into it. Sarah, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm thrilled. And we met at a super cool event where you were moderating or actually interviewing someone who had written a biography at the New York Public Library. And I met you and I went, you are the coolest and I want to have you on the show. And I'm so glad that you were able to do that. I want to jump right in and sort of go back to the beginning, if you don't mind.
Of
When
course.
Thanks. When you think back to sort of the instant or the moment that really ignited your passion for telling stories about complicated families and Jewish feminism and creative resilience, do you have an early experience or spark that set you on the path that eventually led to the Singer Sisters? And if so, what was it and how do you follow it?
I mean, I think that it's a very typical early path in that I was just one of those kids who loved to read, and I
Mm.
see it. My children both love to read, but they read more widely. They read nonfiction, they read comics. But what I really loved from the very beginning were novels
Hmm.
about families, about young girls usually, but also people of any gender. I was into all the classics, Anne of Green Gables and All of a Kind Family and The Secret Garden and all those kinds of classic coming of age novels. And I was one
Hmm.
of those people I would walk down the streets of New York with my nose in a book. I would read in a car, which now makes me so nauseous just to think about. And I was very early on turning what I read into writing these very clearly imitative stories where, I have a book of short stories, quote unquote short stories I wrote in second grade, where all the names are just borrowed from All of a Kind Family. All the
I
characters
love
are
it.
borrowed. But I was already sort of taking what I was reading and turning that into writing from a very young age. And I think it's almost sort of this naive thing where all these characters like Joe from Little Women wants to be a writer, and Emily from Emily and New Moon, which is by the same author as Anne of Green Gables, wants to be a writer. And so because they wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be a writer.
Hmm.
So I went right ahead and believed that I could do it. But when I was a little bit older, I also got very interested in journalism. I think just because I'm a curious person, I
Hmm.
think a lot of journalists just start out really wanting to know things. And if you're someone who finds yourself obsessively Googling or reading things on Wikipedia, you have that curiosity in you. And that also, I think, was just a big reason that I was such a big reader and a big reason that I ended up pursuing journalism first before I started writing fiction.
You know, it's so interesting that you say that. Curiosity is one of the pivotal things in my life. It has stood me in really good stead and gotten me in trouble, I have to admit. But I guess the question that I have about that notion of following the curiosity, have you ever gotten in trouble? Like you follow your curiosity to somewhere and you were led to somewhere where, you know what, I don't know that I really wanted to know this.
I read someone's diary when I was a kid that I ended
Mm.
up being very sorry that I had. So yes, that was one example. I was pretty young.
Yeah.
And I didn't think it was gonna, I didn't think I was prying. I thought it was just a journal. So that's one example. I always think about Harriet the Spy getting in
Hmm.
trouble, or like the burn book in Mean Girls, or there's so many examples in movies and literature of that curiosity and that need to document everything ending up getting people in trouble. And I'm sure that I you know I'm sure that there are more examples from when I was a kid and part of a million different club, again, imitating art. I was in a million different clubs with my friends who were all obsessed with the Babysitters Club books, which were very popular
Mm-hmm.
in the early 90s, and excluding each other and including each other. So I have no doubt that that is only one example of curiosity getting me in trouble. But it was a scorcher of a lesson.
I have,
Yeah, not to, yeah. I
yeah.
felt so terrible for intruding.
Yeah, and it's funny because
Yeah.
in the moment, I'm not sure we realize when we're intruding until someone tells us, oh, that's really
Right.
private. And then you have
Right.
to sort of understand the differentiation between what's private and what's not private. And I'm sure with your own kids, you have to sort of teach those lessons even as they are learning all about where their curiosity is going to take them. And
Absolutely.
and it's so interesting to me because I have cat children. I don't have human children, but I imagine that there's something about uh, sort of guiding young people, and I teach for one of the things I do, and there's something about to me about guiding young people to sort of find their own curiosity that is really profound. But you've spoken about writing the Singer Sisters at times when you had maybe some frustrations when you were sort of early motherhood. Did you develop, and if so, what were they, any specific processes or practices or strategies that helped you take some of that real world overwhelm, perhaps, and make it into something of a refuge for yourself?
Yes. I mean, it's very interesting because in some ways the way people talk about pressure creating diamonds or whatever, like the pressure of that moment in time where I was a new mother. I had a sort of older baby slash toddler. I made the mistake of taking a new job when
Mm,
I was still, my kid wasn't even a year old yet and wasn't sleeping through the night. And so I was overwhelmed at work. As we all know, new jobs are overwhelming. And now I would tell somebody, do not take a new job in the first year of your child's life. But what did I know? It was my first child. I had a new job and I wasn't sleeping and I was so creatively starved
mhm,
that I just felt this drive to write. And so I really drafted the novel very quickly. What I did actually was a few things. I signed up for a writing group, even though I had an MFA and I technically didn't need any further formal instruction. I signed up for this amazing writing group that was designed to get everyone really creating a lot of pages. So we met, instead of meeting once a week, we met every 2 weeks. And then on the off weeks, we were supposed to send in pages. So the idea was to just keep writing for 6 months, I think. And it was just it was incredible because it also got me out of the house one night every 2 weeks.
mhm,
And it was far away. It was on the other side of New York City in Bed-Stuy, and I live in Harlem. So there was an
mm,
hour train ride each way, and I was actually writing on the train, and reading other people's work and just having that full hour to be in a different, to sort of travel from one world, the world of diapers and formula, um, to the world of being around a big wooden table with other writers and talking about our processes. And that was really great. But I also just really embraced during that time this, yeah, idea of just writing whenever I had a few moments. So that was on my lunch break, after my kid had gone to bed, on the weekends, just really trying to get in these 400, 500 word chunks, which is easy when you're feeling inspired. And I really was. So, so this belief that, even if you have 10, 15 minutes, you can use it to write was, I think, a huge part of that, enabling me to create the draft really quickly. And then it was a long process of revision, and there was a big break in there when COVID happened. But it was, I do encourage other writers to just, not you're never going to have this perfect time where you're sitting at a desk. Well, you know this. You're sitting at a desk and there's ambient music playing and you have no errands to do and no chores to do and no one's bothering you. It doesn't happen very often. So you have to take the chunks of time that you get. And what was really funny was that a couple years later, after the novel was published, I had lunch with somebody from that job who inherited my computer when I left. And she told me that every day she still gets a little calendar reminder from when I was there telling her to write 500 words.
I love it.
And she's kept it, she's kept it because she thinks it's funny. And I didn't even remember that I had done that, but I was just really setting that goal for myself that every day I don't even know if it was 500, maybe it was even 300. It was every day just write a little bit
Right.
when you have that break from work. So I would love to say that I'm similarly productive now, but it's easier in some ways because my kids are older, I have more time, but it's harder because I don't feel that total in sort of all-consuming drive to create something of my own now because I'm more relaxed in
Right.
general. So I have to find I'm in the process of trying to find a whole new creative way of being and for this stage of life. And I think that's something that another thing that I tell people is that for each stage of life you have to kind of reinvent the wheel in terms of
Hmm.
finding time and finding space and finding motivation. It's never going to be the same for each project.
No, I would agree with that for sure. And you know, it's interesting what you just said, how the way your creative changes. But I guess the question I'm asking is it going to be written or are you pursuing music or singing or something like that?
While I was writing the book.
No, no, no. Like you're saying, you're in the process of finding something that is a new path of creativity for yourself. Is it still going to be writing? Are you going to keep writing, or are you interested in ceramics, or I want to go take
That's
voice lessons, or
That's a great question. I think for the moment, writing is kind of my thing. I wish that I had talent in the performing arts, but I do not. But I do think, I really love, my husband and I were talking about, we love doing little art projects as a way of getting into the creative mindset. So that is
mm-hmm,
something that I think I recommend for people. If you are an artist, you can try free writing, or if you're a writer, you can try doodling, or
mm-hmm,
if you're a musician, try sketching. I think that one of the things that we forget in our kind of very hyper-focused world is the way we can get inspiration from other art forms
for
and
sure.
also from just experiencing other art forms. For me as a writer, one of the like two of the best things I can do to inspire myself are go to an art museum or listen to live music.
Mm-hmm.
Or go to the theater. I love going to the theater because I could never write for the theater. It's
Ah,
just not my thing. But but it's so stimulating for me for that reason because I'm not sitting there thinking like I can't do this or I could do this. I'm just enjoying it for what it
mm-hmm,
is.
mm-hmm.
I think that's the same with painting. I can just actually really appreciate the art without feeling competitive or trying to get ideas or anything like that. It's just pure. And I think that is so important for all of us who are creative to try to find that, inspiration in other mediums. So I definitely, that idea of going on an artist date that you hear about from the artist's way, I think that's so crucial.
I completely agree. First time I went through the artist's way was 1997, and
Wow.
yeah, it was a long time ago. And that's where out of that I wrote my first book, and I've now written what, 9 books. So
Wow.
yeah, and I do still do morning pages every day. Only now they're a little bit different because I have a reusable, you can and I use wet erase markers on my journal, so
Oh,
I don't keep
cool.
using I don't want to kill trees if I don't have to. You know, it is interesting to me what you said about. Well, everything you're saying is interesting, I guess. That's a silly way to start this question. But yeah, I feel like that notion of go experience creative work that is nothing like what you do is so important. And I also feel like, and actually, I did that. Uh, a couple of years ago, I did a creative art piece. I actually did a digital painting every single day for a year to see what it would
That's
look
cool.
like. Yeah, and the trick was I had gave myself no more than 15 minutes a day to do it. So it had to be super fast, and it revolutionized how I draw and how I paint, which is great. But I also did the same thing with stories. I did a short story a day for a year, every single day for a year. And that was 1 minute that I had to write that story. And that also revolutionized how I write, because boy, do you have to, when you have no time, you have to get
Yeah.
very inspired very quickly. But you know what's interesting is that there's this notion that you've brought up that is do the opposite of what you know and see what that's like. And in your writing, I feel like there's some of that kind of struggle as well. You would expect some families to be happy who aren't, and some families who seem like they are very contentious are actually each other's staunchest allies. And I'm wondering if there is anything that you can talk about within the Singer Sisters that looks at that kind of struggle for family and connection for between families or within families, and also how art can bring disparate families or contentious families together.
Yes. So I was really, so one of the things that I think is really interesting is that I was really kind of writing against my personal experience. I keep telling people I come from a family that loves and appreciates the arts so much. Like, there were books, tons of books in my family's house. People always commented about that, and there was always music playing. So very arts oriented, but not, and very creative. But all three other members of my immediate family are attorneys,
Mm,
and they do wonderful work with for employees against employers. But
nice.
um, but I think that right, so that this idea of writing a novel about a family of very kind of outrageously self-centered and contentious singers and songwriters was just it appealed to me because it was so different from what I knew. And but of course we're always looking for the sort of the commonality. And so I loved the idea of a family where, all of the sublimated emotions and the competition and the jealousy and the rivalry and the forgiveness and the anger is all being expressed better through songs
Mm,
than it can be expressed in person, and that this is their medium for communication, their best medium for communication. And there's so, you read so many stories about people who were really difficult as human beings and but like so poignant as songwriters. And I grew up being the child of boomers. I was just a huge fan of Dylan and Joan Baez and all these folk singers who tell stories with their songs. And but also, have sort of this, I mean, obviously everyone got re-obsessed with the Dylan Baez relationship after the Dylan movie came out a couple of years ago. But so that kind of stuff really interested me, like the way that interpersonal relationships are playing out through song, and even with, like Beyonce and Jay-Z, and the way their marriage was being reflected back to us through their albums, and Taylor Swift taking her relationships and turning them into music, kind of in almost in real time. And how much are the relationships that you hear about in the songs actually reflective of what was really like? I mean, we just will never know. It's all fiction, and but it's also beautiful, and we're relating to it because it's human. It was just that was the kernel of, this the heart of the book. So I created this family where all four members are artists and musicians, and they each have a different approach to art. There's a mother named Judy, who's sort of the pure, would call like the pure artist, who's like got the raw talent as a songwriter. It really like just spills out of her the way you read about these 19, 20-year-olds who just write incredible songs just out of nowhere, like the Beatles did when they were teenagers. And she's really talented, but she's very ambivalent about fame and performing and the music industry. And her husband Dave is, loves the industry and loves being a working performer and loves being on stage. And there's their daughter and son each have kind of take some of their parents' different personalities. And there's an aunt named Sylvia who's an interpreter of songs and has a beautiful voice, but doesn't write songs. So I tried to sort of spread all these different qualities of artists throughout the family. So even though everyone in the family is a singer, and some are songwriters, and they're all performers, they all have different relationships to their art and how that kind of reflects in their collaboration and also their feuds and their conflict over time and there are some big family secrets that are just kind of the engine of the book. But so it's interesting because everything that you talk about and think about with this podcast and with your creativity is also what I was playing with in the book by having every single character be a creative person who struggles with, art versus family and art, art versus fame and art versus like the financial realities of being an artist and all that stuff. So it was a fun chance to kind of play with that with a whole bunch of different characters.
I love that so much. And it kind of, as you were speaking and as I was doing my research to ask you these questions, the thing that kept popping up to me was Amadeus, right? The notion of two people who are doing the same thing. One is effortless. One,
Yeah.
oh, it's all in my head. I just have to catch up and write it all down.
Yes.
Good old Mozart. And then Salieri
Mozart.
being so
Diligent.
diligent and wanting just an
Yes.
iota of that brilliance. And I'm
Yep.
wondering how you feel about that. How do you feel about the comparison, first of all? And second of all, that notion of almost visionary versus implementer. There are some people in my mind who are. They are artists and that they cannot do anything else. And some people are more implementers who can do the nuts and bolts, but may never feel that astonishing spark of
That lightning
inspiration.
bolt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison. I love Amadeus. Actually, it's on my list of movies to
Mm,
watch with my classic movies to rewatch with my husband. We have like a running shared Google Doc.
nice.
And I also love it because I just love all movies about music, which is one of the reasons I got inspired to write this book. Um, Yeah, I think it's a good comparison. I think, none of my characters are maybe as far to the extremes as Mozart and Salieri in that story, but they are on that spectrum, right?
Hmm.
Where Judy represents sort of more of the Mozart in the family, and that she's the sort of everyone kind of agrees that she has the most raw talent as a songwriter and a composer, kind of like Mozart, but she's also a woman and a mother, and that and so I think that part of what I was trying to explore with the book is what would happen if there was a Bob Dylan or a Mozart level genius who was also existing as a woman in the world and had to deal with things like sexual harassment from record labels
Sure.
and being a mom and her own parents' expectations for her to be, a good to continue the family on, that kind of stuff. And so that was something that I was interested in. I mean, I took some inspiration from someone, like Joni Mitchell, who had a baby before she launched her career and gave the baby up for adoption, and because she felt that she could not pursue her dream and be a mother at the same time, and that shows up, that sadness or the sacrifice she had to make shows up over and over again in her incredible songs that
For
she
sure.
gave us.
Hmm.
So that those were some of the real sort of historical things that I was playing with when I wrote the book. And one of the fun things about writing a book where you're borrowing from all these real historical figures, but not doing a one-to-one. It wasn't like an actual fictionalization of a single folk singer. It was just being able to take some of the themes from Joni Mitchell's life and some things from Joan Baez's life and some things from, other folk singers who ended up having children and having a family, like the Wainwright McGarrigle family, where the whole family went into the music biz, and sort of picking and choosing which parts felt resonant to me.
I yeah, and the there are little in the book. It feels like there are little touchstones, and if you know some of the stories, you might go, "Oh, that's reminiscent of." Nothing
Exactly.
too overt, but definitely
Exactly.
it's almost like a scent that you scent
Yes.
on the wind, and you go, "What is that?"
Yeah.
That reminds me of
Yes.
something, but you don't necessarily know
Yes.
what it is, and that's kind of what I
Yes.
felt like reading the book.
Yes.
Um, I do
Yes.
want
Like
to.
Easter eggs almost
Yes,
for
it
music
really did
fans.
feel like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you
Right.
know your music of the I would say 50s,
Yeah.
60s and early 70s, you're
Yep.
probably going to sort of get these little juicy tidbits that
Right.
they're almost like morsels
Exactly.
you get to enjoy, which I think is great.
Exactly.
So, moving a little bit further into that, I feel like some of the storytelling I you can obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like some of the rhythm of the language was almost rhythmic. Like, I'm a musician also, so I'm working at it from the perspective of being a songwriter as well
Yes.
as a writer of books and plays. But it felt sometimes like the rhythm of scenes and the rhythm of dialogue almost felt like musical rhythms that you were sort of interweaving, if that makes sense, to give a more musical, almost lyrical experience when reading the book on the page. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, I that's very flattering. Thank you. I was certainly, trying, particularly when, the book moves a little bit in perspective between some of the different women in the family, and certainly was 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 definitely trying to kind of go back and forth from the idea that both the actual lyrics that are in the book are meant to tell the story, and then the story itself is also meant to be lyrical. So
Hmm.
that there's an interplay between those two things where Emma and Judy, they think musically, they're musicians. So I was definitely trying to evoke that in some scenes for sure.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't off the rails there because I was
Not at
going
all.
that feel this feels and I talk when I interview musicians, and there are times when, for example, they have I interviewed the music producer Odyssey on a previous
Oh,
episode.
cool.
Yeah, and he's great. And I interviewed him, and when I was listening to his music to prepare for the interview, I kept seeing these like Joni Mitchell levels of internal rhyme, and I was like,
Hmm.
14 lines later, there's the rhyming word for something,
Right.
and he goes, "Oh, you got
Yes.
that? Most people don't get that." And I'm like, I wonder if on some level being a musician sort of
Yeah.
opens that door.
Yes.
And so have musicians come up to you and talk to you about their experience of having read the book and
Y-
what they got out of it and what they feel about it?
Yes. I mean, it's been so gratifying because obviously I did fact check the music stuff
Hmm.
with my husband is works in the music world. He's not a musician either. And then I also had a friend who had been a roadie in the 90s to all these sort of folk acts from like the
Mm.
Northampton scene. So I had her read like the opening of the book that takes place kind of on the road. And so there were I was definitely trying to make sure that it felt accurate, but I think what was there is with all art, there is this moment of imaginative leap. Like I have never been on stage with a guitar,
Mm.
and but I have been in the audience many times. So those scenes were really just my many, many years of experience being in the audience, imagining what it would be like to be on stage. And I have heard from musicians that they've been surprised that I'm not to sound like, but they've been surprised that I'm not a musician because they feel like I captured some of that. And I really think it comes from being a fan and also a fan who's a fellow artist in some level. So who really is sitting there in the audience, not just thinking about my experience, but wondering what it's like to be on the other side of the stage. And I did one event in Ohio when the book came out and my questioner, my interviewer was a folk musician.
Uh-huh.
And she was hilarious. And she felt, she was very excited about the book because she felt like it captured that era. So, that was probably the most gratifying part of the entire publication process was, I mean, what a wonderful, just what a wonderful thing it says about imagination and art that we can, you know, listen to each other and learn from each other and then try to recreate each other's experiences in different mediums. And it's just so fun and so cool.
It really is. And I remember very well back in 1997 was the first time I stood on stage and played guitar. I had never played guitar. I had, learned, I studied. If you know folk music, you ever heard of Al Petaway?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so
Uh-huh.
he was a dear friend of mine and my husband's, he
Oh,
and his wife
wow.
Amy. We knew them. Hang on one second. I'm gonna have to clear my throat because otherwise I'm just gonna cough. I'll be right back. Sorry about that.
No
I got a
worries.
little emotional there for a second. Anyway, Al he was also on the show before he passed, a little over a year and a half ago, and he's obviously a brilliant musician, and he gave me a couple of lessons, and he was arguably one of the finest fingerstyle guitarist of the 20th century, I think. And I won't even say arguably, I would say top 10 at least. And, what he said to me was something that I thought was very interesting. He said, no matter what, you have to play your music and your audience will find you. And I feel a little bit like in what you're talking about, these people who are going to make the music they're going to make, some of them are looking at it from a slightly different perspective, because, as you said, the dad is kind of going, well, let's talk about the music business because it is a
Right.
business, and some people are like, no, the music is the love of the game, and that's what we want to do.
Right.
But I feel like when we're talking about this notion of, you said, standing up in front of an audience for the first time, as I said, I very much recall doing that. And I remembered Al's words as I'm standing there quaking in my boots going, you have to play your songs. Just play them.
Yeah.
That's it. And you're sharing. And so I guess what I want to know from you right now is, we're living in a world where sharing doesn't always feel safe. And so
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this. We're interviewing you about this book, and also just this notion of being a Jewish feminist. Can you talk a
Uh-huh.
little bit about that, if you're willing to, because I think it's a topic that I think we need to be discussing more.
Yeah.
Women, Jewish
Yeah.
feminists, Jewish feminist artists. There's
Yeah.
so much to unpack there. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your experience as a Jewish feminist artist,
Yes.
woman, writing this
Yes.
book and also being out there in the world with it?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think so. Yeah, I mean, it is scarier than it used to be. And I think, having kind of come of age with the internet, and I used to be on Twitter all the time before it became X, and just seeing the way people, even assuming that everyone has the best intentions, that, th people's your mistakes can get amplified, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Or, your and it's, it's scary both for me. I've had, because I'm Jewish and I've written about abortion and things like that. I I've gotten hate from the right wing, and like, I still sometimes get really nasty messages. And then on the other hand, I've seen, um uh, like, can't, quote unquote, I don't know if, like, I hate to use the word cancel culture, but it does exist. Like, even, and among my fellow feminists, right? Where, like, someone is deemed to be like an improper feminist because she's making too much money or she said the wrong thing. And, and so then there's tearing down there too, like within the group that's supposed to be safer. It's safer. So there's just a lot of noise and a lot of criticism and a lot of anger, particularly on the internet, particularly around these sensitive issues of identity, whether it's being Jewish in our post October 7th world, or being a feminist in this world right now that we're living in, where there's a huge backlash against feminism happening. It's hard to tune it out. It really is. And I think that what I come back to is, this idea that being creative is the antidote to all of that. That you
Mm-hmm.
have to, at least while you're creating, to shut down the part of your brain that says, like, but what are people going to say? Or how are they going to react to me when I share this? You have to kind of tell that voice to come back later.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise you'll never get anything created. And it's hard. I think you have to do it every time, kind of. At least if you're someone who's aware of all that noise. And I am, because I'm a very curious person, right? So when there are feuds, and there are literary feuds and feminist feuds, I'm always the first one to be like, okay, tell me what happened, who's mad at who. Like, give me the details. I want the breakdown of, who got in trouble, because it's interesting to me, because it's human folly, and novelists love human folly. But I do think that that then can lead to fear that you're gonna, get criticized or told that, something you said was wrong. Um, and that's hard. And I think for this book, I just at least felt like it was for me, this book felt like this garden I was tending during the COVID years, and during the years of early motherhood, the beginning of the Trump era, and sort of the beginning of this difficult period that we're living in now. it was my, yeah, it was my refuge from that. So it was felt, you know, it felt positive to put it out there in the world. And whatever, to the extent that I'm working on fiction now, what I'm working on now is more, in some ways, more political, and that's, it's feels harder to write that for the reasons that I just said. So, you know, I don't have an answer except that, you know, I would tell people that the world needs your art. You need your art. And I think, you know, whatever identity you carry with you, that it's, you know, your story deserves to be told. And there's only, you know, you're the only one with your perspective on the world. So, um, you know, it was such a revelation to me that I could write a novel that arose from my obsession with and love of pop culture. I think I thought that I had to write something from like the depths of my personal pain, or, you know, and of course there's a lot of pain and emotional, you know, emotional depth in my book, but that it, you know, that it could come from just what I'm obsessed with and what I love to listen to and what I love to think about. Um, that felt amazing. And I, you know, I encourage everyone who's creative, whatever medium you create in, to make a list of your obsessions or have a running list in your head of like what really gets you going. Even if it's The Bachelor or um collecting stamps or whatever it is, like if there is, you know, like how can you channel that and make it into something, you know, that feels really, if it feels really good, then that you're onto something.
There's this fluidity that
Hmm.
you move between and among the fiction that you write and the journalism and editing at Lilith and cultural criticism. And I would love to find out from you, with respect to you yourself and also the people you talk to about their own creativity, how do you reconcile those, or maybe how do those modes of creating speak to each other? And what can people who are perhaps aspiring creatives learn from blending these approaches to build something deeper and more grounded?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think I was just actually at a book launch yesterday where the writer had just written her first novel after years of writing essays. And you know, there's first of all, there's a lot of similarity, right? You're, whether it's journalism or fiction or creative nonfiction, you're telling a story, you're gathering details, you're making sure that the details are important and contribute to the story and are significant. And you know, for me at least, like what's really important to me as a writer is clarity and being able to really communication with my readers, whether whatever form I'm writing, whether it's the blog post or a novel. Like I don't want I want it to be as super clear. Clarity is my North Star, I think, in my prose. But I think the difference is, right, that in fiction you're really, you're dealing with momentum and metaphor. So in journalism you want everything to kind of, you know, in the course of a few pages, everything to be revealed. In fiction, you are constantly pushing your reader forward. So you want to have some kind of narrative momentum and not leave them satisfied for until, so that you want them to keep reading. And then you're also, all your details have to kind of have a metaphorical significance. So um you have to think about the emotion behind details, whereas with journalism, you're just kind of trying to tell a story with the details. So you want to, you know, paint a picture in your reader's head. And with fiction, you want to paint a picture in your reader's head and also like plant some emotional seeds for them for the, you know, the next chapter. So it's, I think fiction, there's more layers. And it's for me definitely much harder, which is why I think a lot of people feel this way about who write feel this way about novels, that they're the hardest thing to write. And so, you know, they're like an irresistible challenge. And, you know, but there's also something very satisfying, at least for me, with, I find journalism really satisfying because you have the reporting that you've done and you have to kind of build the story just around that. You can't make things up. You have to kind of use what you have ahead, like your research that's sitting in front of you, and turn that into a story. So I think they're really both, they complement each other and they are really different. And I feel I feel so lucky to get to work in both mediums. And our new CEO slash editor in chief at Lilith, where I work, is also a novelist, and so it's really fun to. And I similarly work with one of my colleagues is a comics artist and a cartoonist. So it's really fun to be around people who are working in different, creative modes, on and off, and to kind of see how our daily work running a magazine is both is and isn't reflected in our more quote unquote more artsy, more creative work outside of the office. I don't know. I'm trying to think of other ways that those two things complement each other. I think just like what unites them is what I talked about earlier, which is just my endless curiosity and wanting to know more. I think that's the connective thread, and using writing to find out. Writing as sort of detective work.
Yeah, and right there is something I one of the genres I write in is I write mysteries,
Right.
and working on that and figuring that out for myself and sort of going, okay, it's I have a non-traditional quote unquote detective. She's a professional tarot card reader,
Oh my God,
and
I love that so
oh,
much.
it's a lot of fun to write, right? And I've written book one in the series, and then there are three more, and it's going to be a minute. But the point is for me is that one of the things that I try to do is to really make the world uh, concrete and yet at the same time rich in the world of the book. I tried to make that, and I noticed that about the Singer Sisters also, that the world that you built it feels very tangible and also just a little out of reach. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your world building for Singer Sisters and how you approached it as a journalist. And maybe you didn't, maybe you were just wearing the creative writing hat at that point. But what brought you to creating this world that feels, as I said, both so intimate and yet just a little out of reach?
Well, for the as I joked to everyone, for the scenes that were set in the 90s, I did not feel that I needed to do a lot of research because I lived in New York in the 90s. I was a teenager, really soaking everything in. But in the for the 60s, I mean, so part of it was also that I chose those two decades, of course, because it makes sense that a parent and child would come of age in those two decades. They're 30
Mm-hmm.
years apart, but also because the music and culture of the 90s threw back deliberately to the 60s. And so when we were walking around Greenwich Village in our bell bottoms in the 90s, it very much felt like we were in conversation with those same streets and
Mm-hmm.
um, those same clubs, the music venues, as how they'd been in the 60s. Like there was this real feeling of nostalgia. So that was what I was channeling. And I read some very kind of, I did a very random but intense deep dive into memoirs and biographies of musicians from the 60s, as well as a kind of very, very detailed um, nonfiction book about folk music in the village in the 60s so that I could really get some of the texture of the world in, um, and I like things like how they dressed. I read Carly Simon's memoir, and I was, I loved it. It was such a fun memoir to read. But I also picked up things like she talked about how she and her sisters, who were in a folk group together, like what kind of outfits they were wearing when they went on stage
Mm-hmm.
early on before she got famous. And that was the kind of thing that I wanted to I used almost to fact check those parts of the book, to do the world building. And it was, yeah, it's been gratifying when baby boomer readers say that they think it's a pretty good approximation of what it was like to sneak down to West Fourth Street and listen to folk music in clubs, because I did, that was the part that I hadn't lived through, and I really wanted to make sure that I felt spiritually connected to it because of my being a New Yorker and knowing the neighborhoods and stuff. But I also wanted to feel like I had a firm grasp of what was some of the details. So I read some really fun biographies, and I read like I read some biographies of musicians who weren't folk musicians. Like I read a really great new biography of Janis Joplin, and it was so helpful, because it was like it helped me kind of understand what I'd already created with the family dynamics that there could be, you could have like these hippie musicians that Janis Joplin left home and ran away and was like living on the streets in San Francisco and doing all kinds of drugs and having, casual sex, but she was also writing these plaintive letters home. She never lost touch with her parents, and she was really trying to get them to understand her. So that the idea that my character could run away and go to Greenwich Village and still be in touch with her parents, or have them having kind of have an eye on her felt actually appropriate, so it was things like that that I think the research really helped to clarify and smooth out when I was editing and revising the book.
Amazing. And I love the connection between I'm right between I'm Gen X, so I'm looking
Yeah,
at baby boomers and I'm looking at
yeah,
your generation and kind of going,
yeah,
because
yeah,
I was too young to experience the
right.
60s and I was probably too old for what you're talking about in the
Well, yeah,
in
I
the
mean,
90s.
my character I think is a Gen X. Is my Emma is Gen X. She's like old, younger Gen X. And
Mhm.
I'm a millennial who really looked up to Gen X musicians, right? That was my, when I was 14, 15, the musicians that I was really into were in their 20s. So
Right.
I feel like for me, as an elder millennial, I have like an affinity for Gen X culture. At least some, there was a line. So it's very interesting. Like the fact that I could like jaw with you for 2 hours about Gen X versus millennial music and culture and baby boomers and how it all affected each other shows that I'm obsessed with this stuff, and that's why it made its way into my first novel,
Sure.
because it's really interesting.
And it's so interesting. And I wonder sometimes if when we are living it, we fail to grasp just how interesting and fascinating the culture around us is. What are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. I think that, we all feel that way probably when we're young because, but I was just saying about how in the 90s everything was like, oh, we missed the 60s. There's that famous line from the Radiohead song, The Bends, where he says, I wish it was the 60s. Um, and the Counting Crows have this line like, I want to be Bob Dylan. So like all throughout that culture that I was growing up in, I was not the only one who was thinking about the 60s all the time. Like all the musicians I admired were also thinking about the 60s. But now when I look back, we all, maybe at least five, now we're kind of in a moment where Y2K culture is back in, but like
Right.
5 years ago, 90s culture was super in all of a sudden, and everyone was looking back at the 90s as this really authentic time, with great music and really fun fashion and grunge and all the stuff. And I'm like, right, we were part of something. It was, at least compared to what came afterwards, kind of gum pop. It did feel really authentic.
Yeah.
Or does now seem really authentic, even
Right.
though at the time, we were longing for something else. But I think that's just sort of like the nature of nostalgia, and also the nature of being young, right? Like you don't realize, like youth is wasted on the young. You don't realize that you're living in a great and interesting moment because you're angsty,
Right.
when you're a teenager and in your 20s, and then when you get older you're like, oh, that was great. Why was I so cranky about it?
Right. Why didn't I
I was
appreciate it?
young, I was fun, I was right, I was part of something.
Right. Although, to be fair, like, I don't know if you follow television shows at all, but I remember that 70s show came out in
Yes,
the aughts,
right,
and that was great. And then they tried to do that 80s show, and it went
right,
wah, wah, and it got
right.
canceled after like three
Yes.
episodes. And then they brought back sort of a that 70s show revival, but called it that
Uh-huh.
90s show or something like
Uh-huh.
that. They just skipped right over the 80s. They went, yeah, we tried it. People didn't want it. And I sometimes go, okay, that was the yuppie era. And I
Yeah,
wonder
that's true.
if that was just if that's just not interesting enough for people to try and be nostalgic about because
I think
not sure it was.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's kind of an anti-nostalgia for the 80s, like the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, and you know, stuff like culture that revisits the 80s is sort of a more negative
Mm-hmm.
spin for that reason. And but at the same time it was, the era of Madonna, Cyndi Lauper. So there are some aspects of it that people still, and Prince.
Prince, Michael Jackson. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
When Prince died, like that outpouring was so intense. And you also realize that during that era, like during the yuppie era, it must have been so important. And I'm sure, I was still like fairly young. So, but I mean, like if you were a teenager or in your 20s and the culture around you was very conformist, like how important a figure like Prince or David Bowie must have felt even more important in some ways because they were not the norm.
Oh, for sure. And
Yeah.
one of my friend's brothers was a music producer who was worked at the Purple House, and said, "Yeah, Prince. What you imagine about Prince is absolutely true. He is a genius. He lives half in this world, half in another universe altogether. But do not ever doubt that he is the consummate musician."
Yeah.
And I went, that pretty much describes Prince to me, and I feel like that was
Yeah.
accurate. And he and his music have my heart for sure. I snuck out of the house when I was way too young to go for the For You and the Dirty Mind tours. I was
Oh,
way
I
too
love
young to
that.
go, but I did it. And
Yeah.
I went to the David Bowie, the Serious Moonlight tour. That was one of my first concerts. And then China Girl, Let's Dance, all of that. I was a little too young to go to anything else that he had done before that. But I got to tell you, that stuff was life altering when you're
Yeah.
13 and you sneak into a
Yep.
Prince show or David Bowie show. Or here, I was sneaking in CBGB when I was 13, 14 years old.
Yes.
I was
Yes.
sneaking in and saw
Yes.
Blondie and saw the
Right.
Police and saw the Talking
Totally.
Heads because they let me in because they didn't know I was just 13. And they
Right.
may not have cared, but there's something to be said, I think, about this notion of people who love music
Yeah.
will always seek it out. And I
Yes.
would love if you have any closing thoughts on that. If you want to recommend, because I know I could keep you here for like another 6 hours chatting about this, but can you recommend a musician, let's say a folk musician or whoever you want to recommend, that someone that people might not have heard of, but that you really love, and will maybe put a link to their website or something on the show notes?
Well, I am a huge fan of Dar Williams, speaking of
Ah,
Generation
love Dar
X.
Williams. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've evangelized her to my interns at work. Yeah, because she's that really from that very classic vein of like focused storytelling, and she's very, very witty and funny. And she really does tell interesting stories. And she's also the master of stage patter. Like she's so funny when you
Mm-hmm.
in between her songs, it feels like you're at a stand-up show. So yes, Dar is great. And and my husband, being in the music world, he's taken me to see lots of young female, or I guess maybe not so young anymore, singer-songwriters like Mitski um, is one example, and it's so fun to see another generation of women with guitars being awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And with Dar Williams, The Christians and the Pagans is one of my favorite songs by her.
It's such a great
Such a
song.
great song.
Yeah,
I love it.
yes. I love it. She comes to New York around between Christmas and New Year's almost every year, and she always closes with that song, and
Oh, and why
it's
wouldn't
very
she?
nice. Yeah. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Love it. Love it. Well, as I said, I could keep you here for another 5 hours because I have so many other questions, but maybe you'll come back at some point
I
when the
would
next
love
book
to.
comes out. Uh,
Yes.
but if someone is trying to find you, where should they go? If you don't mind sharing like your website and or maybe your socials so people can follow you,
Yeah.
I would love it if you would share that out, please.
Of course. So the socials that I'm most active on these days is Instagram. I'm Sarah with an HM Seltzer, like seltzer water or Alka-Seltzer. So Sarah M Seltzer at Instagram, and that's also my handle on all the other, scattered social media sites. So and also on Blue Sky and on Threads. That's where to find me. And my website is also just sarahmseltzer.com. And it has a link to my all my writing and my book and a funny bio.
Nice. I love it. Well, and I
Lists
will
all my
definitely.
favorite foods.
I have something like that. I have favorite
Yeah,
foods and like backpack or
important.
purse, and I'm like
Exactly. These
backpack
are
all the way.
these are important questions.
They sometimes are. They sometimes are for sure. Well, Sarah, I will definitely put that in the show notes. And before I let you go, I have two silly questions
Yes.
that I ask everybody who comes on the show. And as I said earlier, they're silly, but I find that they can yield some profound results. And before I ask them, I would like to thank you once again for being here. This has been such a treat and such a great conversation.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. You had great questions.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I strive for that. All right, so here we go. The first question is, what is it that gets you up in the morning? And I don't mean your alarm.
Coffee. The
Woman
sound
after
of
my own
my
heart.
the sound of we have a pre-programmed coffee maker. So it's like one of our joys just to set it so that we know that it will be like we can smell the coffee as it's
Ah.
brewing when we wake up. And I don't know what I would do without it.
Oh, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Absolutely. It's one of my favorite joys. I make my own, and it's got like maple syrup and hazelnut syrup and
Mm.
cinnamon and oat
Yeah, my
milk.
husband put
And
cinnamon in. Yeah.
it takes the cinnamon just takes the bitterness away. I love it
It
so
takes the
much.
bitterness away. Exactly. Yeah, it's great.
I love, love, love it. Yeah, it's my morning treat. All right, and here is the last question. If you had an airplane, environmentally friendly, of course, that
Of
could
course.
skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
Um, hmm. I mean, it would have to be, um, I would have to be just quote John Lennon and say, give peace a chance.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
fabulous. I think that that's
Yep.
a what a
Speaking of the
profound
60s, yeah, and
right.
70s. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
profound and it's a profound truism. There, we're going to call it
It
that.
really is.
It
Yeah.
really is.
Yeah.
Well,
We've never
Sarah,
tried it, so why not just give it a chance?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it reminds me of that bumper sticker. What if they held a war and nobody came?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
that's where
Exactly.
that's where I go with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, totally.
Sarah, once again, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.
It was my pleasure. You have been listening to the Your Creative Mind podcast. You know you need to go find Sarah Seltzer, Sarah M. Seltzer, on Instagram and follow her there and Threads and wherever else you might get your social, but also check out her website because obviously the Singer Sisters, I loved it. So, and I recommend books for you all the time. This is one you should definitely check out. This is Izolda Trachtenberg for the Your Creative Mind podcast, reminding you, as always, to be curious, be creative, and most of all, be kind. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new, and it would mean the world to me if you told a friend about it. Today's episode was produced by Izolda Trachtenberg and is copyright 2025. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope.